He begged for his life before Alexander the Great, then answered with silence instead of a bow. Weeks earlier, this same man had wounded the conqueror in battle and nearly brought his campaign to a halt before it truly began. His name was Batis, and his refusal to kneel would cost him one of history's cruelest deaths. October 332 BC. The road to Egypt ran straight through a fortress called Gaza, rising on a mound of earth so steep that its defenders believed no army could ever reach its walls. Picture standing at the base of that slope, looking up at archers, stones, and fire waiting above you. How could any commander drag siege engines weighing tons up ground like that? Gaza's governor, a man named Batis, believed the answer was simple. He believed it could not be done, and he was prepared to stake the city's survival on that belief. To understand why Gaza mattered so much, it helps to look at where Alexander had come from and where he was going. His campaign had already carried him down the coast of Palestine, city after city surrendering before a single arrow was fired. Word of his army traveled faster than the army itself, and most governors chose open gates over ruin. Beyond that coastline lay Egypt, and Egypt was no minor prize. It was rich in grain, powerful in trade, and one of the most valuable possessions the Persian king Darius still held in the eastern Mediterranean. If Egypt fell, Darius would lose not just land but leverage, and Alexander would secure the southern edge of an empire that was still being drawn in real time. For most cities along that route, resistance felt pointless. But Gaza looked at the same approaching army and chose differently. Its gates stayed shut. Batis had already filled the granaries, hired Arab mercenaries to strengthen his garrison, and settled in for a siege he believed he could win. He was not hiding behind those walls out of desperation. He was waiting, calm and prepared, the way a man waits when he genuinely believes the ground itself is on his side. Alexander understood immediately why he could not simply march past. A hostile fortress sitting behind his advancing army was not a problem he could postpone. Supply wagons still needed to move through that region. Messengers still needed to travel between the coast and the front. Small detachments, couriers, and stragglers would all become vulnerable the moment Gaza was left standing, untaken, at his back. Before Egypt could open its doors, this city had to fall, whatever the cost. When the Macedonian army finally reached Gaza, the scale of the problem became impossible to ignore. This was not a wall rising from level ground the way most fortified cities were built. Gaza sat elevated above the surrounding desert, a fortress lifted onto its own foundation of earth, forcing every soldier below to tilt his head upward just to see the battlements. On an open plain, Alexander knew exactly how to win. Cavalry could sweep the field, infantry could press forward in disciplined ranks, and movement itself could decide the outcome. Gaza offered him none of that. Here, the defenders held height, patience, and a clear, unobstructed view of anyone who dared approach. Batis did not need to risk his men in the open. He could simply remain where he was and let the terrain do the fighting for him. For the Macedonians, that meant every step toward the city came with exposure. Officers surveying the walls could not hide their intentions. Soldiers gathering on the plain below would be seen and studied long before they ever touched stone. Gaza's true strength was never just its walls. It was the marriage of those walls with the height beneath them. And Alexander understood that raw courage alone would not solve a problem built from geography. A reckless charge could bleed his army dry before the real fight had even started. Too much caution, on the other hand, would delay Egypt and hand Batis exactly the confidence he wanted. So Alexander studied the fortress carefully, walking the ground with his engineers, measuring slope and distance and the shape of every approach. His attention settled on the southern side of the city. It was not an obvious weakness. It was simply the first place that seemed worth testing, the first crack in a problem that otherwise looked seamless from every angle. Alexander turned to the engineers who understood stone, soil, and pressure better than any soldier with a sword. Their first task was to attack where Gaza could not easily watch. Away from the clearest sightlines of the battlements, Macedonian miners began cutting into the earth, a tunnel creeping slowly and silently toward the wall's foundation. If it reached the right point, the stone standing above it could begin to fail from beneath, invisible until it was too late for the defenders to respond. That, the hidden half of the plan. The visible half took shape in full view of the city. Siege towers rose near the southern approach, timber and shields and wheels assembled in plain sight, soldiers gathering around them as officers barked commands that carried easily across the open ground. From the walls, Batis and his men could see everything, and that was exactly the point. While the city's attention fixed on the machines forming outside its gates, the tunnel continued its slow crawl beneath the surface, unseen and unheard. It was deception built from patience rather than trickery, one danger visible and looming, another buried and silent, splitting the defender's focus before a single blow had actually landed. Every part of the Macedonian army had a role to play in that design. Miners needed silence and time below ground. Workers near the towers needed to keep the pressure visible and convincing. Officers measured distances constantly, adjusting the siege works as the days passed. None of it looked glorious. It was patient, grinding labor meant to weaken Gaza long before the real assault ever began. But the desert had its own defenses, ones no amount of planning could fully account for. As the towers began rolling forward across the broken ground, sand dragged hard against their wheels, stealing momentum from every pull. The slope proved heavier and more punishing than the men had expected. Ropes bit into shoulders as crews strained through clouds of dust. Commands shouted from officers answered only by slow, painful, grinding delay. One of the great battle towers became trapped outright, its wheels twisting and sinking beneath its own weight, the wooden frame shaking violently as the soldiers inside felt the structure shift beneath their feet. Still, the assault kept costing strength even as it stalled. Some workers pulled ropes until their palms burned raw. Others braced beams that swayed dangerously with every jolt of uneven ground. The towers crept forward, stopped, and dragged forward again, each pause leaving exposed men vulnerable beneath a city that had done nothing but watch and wait. Alexander could see the effort losing its shape in real time. Pushing harder might gain a few more feet. Forcing too much weight across unstable ground could destroy the machines completely, and they were far too valuable to lose before ever reaching the wall. By late afternoon, with wooden frames cracking and floorboards splitting beneath his own soldiers, Alexander made the call to halt the assault. Gaza had not needed fire or a single arrow to break the momentum of that first attempt. The ground beneath the towers had done enough damage on its own. From above, Batis watched Macedonian momentum stall without his men lifting a single weapon. And for a city that had staked everything on resistance, that image alone was worth more than any single skirmish. The order to stop was not a sign of fear. It was the choice of a commander who understood the ground well enough not to waste men fighting it in failing light. But that pause gave Batis something dangerous, time to read the battlefield, and a growing sense that the machines outside his walls were not as unstoppable as they had first appeared. What happened next would prove far stranger than any battlefield calculation Alexander could have planned for. Before resuming the siege, Alexander performed a customary sacrifice in front of his assembled army. For ancient soldiers, rituals like this were never empty ceremony. Omens could steady nerves before a fight or, just as easily, shatter them. As the sacrifice unfolded, a crow reportedly flew low over Alexander's head and dropped dry mud onto him before settling on one of the nearby siege towers. It was a strange enough image that the army could not simply ignore it, and Alexander called for his seer, a man named Aristander, who had interpreted omens for him many times before. Aristander studied the sign carefully and delivered a warning heavy with both promise and danger. Gaza would fall, he said, but not before Alexander himself was wounded. It was the kind of prophecy that could unsettle even a confident army, a warning that mixed victory with the certainty of personal cost. On Aristander's advice, Alexander held back from any further major action for the rest of that day, choosing caution over momentum for reasons that had little to do with the enemy in front of him. From inside Gaza, none of that hesitation looked like faith or ritual. It looked like stalled machines, tired soldiers, and an opening. Sensing weakness, Batis ordered the gates opened, and Arab mercenaries rushed out toward the siege works that had struggled so badly earlier that day. Their goal was not to destroy the entire Macedonian army in one strike. It was far more precise than that. They wanted the machines, the very towers that had already proven vulnerable, burned and broken before they could ever threaten the walls again. The attack struck the southern approach with sudden violence and speed. Men who had spent the day hauling ropes now grabbed shields and weapons instead, scrambling to defend equipment they had barely managed to move. Alexander did not leave this fight to another commander. He rode toward the danger himself, companions and hypaspists moving with him, and his presence alone stiffened the Macedonian line at its most threatened point. The mercenaries had expected to find frightened workers and unguarded timber. Instead, they found the king of Macedon standing in the dust in front of them. The fighting tightened around the towers as both sides pushed for control of ground. Moments earlier, had belonged to no one. Batis's men caused real damage and real confusion, but the siege works held. Then, in the chaos, danger reached Alexander more closely than anyone around him could have anticipated. According to the ancient account, one attacker dropped to his knees before the king as though begging for surrender, close enough to strike without warning. In a flash, the man lunged upward toward Alexander's throat, and only reflexes let the king avoid what should have been a killing blow. Almost immediately afterward, an arrow found his shoulder. Aristander's warning had not been empty ritual after all. The defenders pulled back toward the city walls with fresh confidence, and from those walls, many inside Gaza believed their king had been badly hurt, perhaps even mortally. Batis had struck the siege works and wounded the man leading the entire campaign. For Gaza, the day felt like proof that resistance could still draw blood from history's most celebrated conqueror. For Alexander, the wound changed nothing about his intentions. It only made the answer he was building toward feel far larger and far more necessary. The wound did not end the siege, and it did not break Alexander's resolve. If anything, it clarified the problem in front of him. The first attempt had shown exactly why Gaza was so difficult to reach. Dragging machines across the southern approach had already cost time, strength, and momentum before a single wall had cracked. Batis had also proven, without question, that Gaza could strike back hard whenever Macedonian pressure slowed. Alexander needed something entirely different this time, not another exhausting push across the same broken, punishing ground. The city's height itself had to be answered before its walls could ever be broken. So Alexander ordered the battlefield to change beneath his own army's feet. Earth, stone, timber, and raw labor were gathered outside Gaza in enormous quantities. Soldiers who had marched across half of Asia became builders instead, hauling basket after basket of soil toward the siege lines day after day. Under the direction of his engineers, thousands of hands worked together to raise an entirely new platform across the southern approach, layer by layer, week after week. This was not a sudden assault meant to shock the city into submission. It was a slow, grinding war of construction, carried out in full view of Gaza's defenders, who could do little but watch it rise. From the walls, Batis could see exactly what was happening below him. The Macedonians were no longer simply trying to climb toward the city. They were building an entirely new piece of ground to meet it on equal terms, and that single idea reshaped the entire siege more than any charge or assault ever could have. Gaza had trusted the mound beneath its own walls completely. Alexander's answer was to raise a second mound directly against it. The work demanded a level of patience that felt almost foreign to an army built for speed and decisive battle. Day after day, men packed the earth wider and higher, knowing the platform eventually had to carry soldiers, artillery, and heavy siege engines without collapsing under their combined weight. If it stayed too low, Gaza would still dominate the fight from above. If it was built too weak, The very machines meant to break the city would tear the platform apart from beneath themselves. So the mound grew slowly, carefully, and relentlessly, dust settling over workers, tools, shields, and endless baskets of packed soil. The defenders above could still look down, technically, but that advantage was shrinking with every single layer added below them. What had once protected Gaza completely was now being answered, piece by piece, from outside its own walls. For several weeks, the Macedonians simply kept building, and the siege itself became less dramatic on the surface, while growing far more dangerous underneath that surface for Gaza. Was there ever a real way to defend a fortress against patience that simply refused to break? Batis understood exactly what would happen once that platform reached the height Alexander needed. Stone-throwing engines and heavy artillery would be dragged onto the new ground, and for the first time in the entire siege, Gaza's walls would face pressure from a level they had never once been forced to consider. That was the danger hidden inside Alexander's slow, methodical approach. He was not retreating from the city's natural advantage. He was removing that advantage one basket of earth at a time, without ever needing to risk another failed charge. When the platform finally reached fighting height, everything about the siege changed at once. Heavy engines were dragged onto the raised position with careful, coordinated effort. Stone throwers, artillery crews, and shielded workers took up new positions that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. For the first time, Macedonian soldiers were no longer firing helplessly up at a fortress that towered over them. The walls that had once looked down on Alexander with total confidence now stood within direct reach of his engines. Alexander ordered the bombardment to begin from that new position, and stones tore into the southern defenses with a force the city had never faced before. Each strike threw dust, broken fragments, and fear across the battlements. Men on the walls pulled back from the most exposed sections, and commands inside the city became harder and harder to hear over the constant noise of impact. Gaza had already endured hunger, waiting, and the slow pressure of a prolonged siege. Now it had to endure raw force delivered from its own level, with nowhere left to hide from it. Alexander was not searching for spectacle in that bombardment. He was searching, methodically, for the exact moment when stone finally became weakness. His crews adjusted their aim again and again, striking the same damaged sections repeatedly until small breaks began to appear, half hidden behind dust and falling debris. Then, gradually, the wounded part of the wall began to change shape entirely. Batis rushed men toward the danger the moment he saw it. Workers inside Gaza scrambling to brace what the engines had already broken, soldiers clearing fallen stone, while officers pushed defenders into whatever positions still made sense. The wall itself had become a race between damage and repair, and Alexander kept the pressure fixed squarely on the southern defenses without pause. He had spent weeks raising the ground for exactly this moment, and the mound had finally brought his engines close enough to matter. Now those engines needed to open a path wide enough for men to walk through. As the bombardment continued without mercy, one section of wall finally began to give way, completely, stone loosening and dust thickening, until a genuine breach started forming in front of both armies. The opening was dangerous, but it was not yet victory, and both commanders understood that clearly. Batis knew the breach had to be held at any cost, or the city would fall within hours. Alexander understood just as clearly that hesitation now could waste every week of exhausting labor had already poured into that mound. Assault troops gathered near the damaged southern wall, hypaspists and hand-picked soldiers preparing to move through the dust the moment the order came. The engines kept striking to keep Gaza's defenders pinned and under constant pressure, and behind that storm of stone, Alexander readied the men who would be first through the gap. The siege had shifted from patient construction back into raw violence in a matter of hours. Earth had raised the Macedonians high enough to finally attack on equal terms. Artillery had forced the wall itself to open. When the signal finally came, the assault surged toward the broken section, Macedonian troops advancing through dust and falling fragments of stone while Gaza's defenders rushed to meet them behind what was left of the shattered masonry. The fight for the breach had begun, and the city was not taken yet, but its single greatest protection had finally, irreversibly, been broken. Once the wall opened, Gaza entered its final struggle. The breach alone did not make the city surrender. It only gave Alexander a way inside, and that way had to be fought for step by step. Macedonian troops pushed through dust, broken stone, and shouting defenders, while Batis's men rushed toward the opening before it could widen any further. Both sides understood exactly what the wall now represented. If the breach held, Gaza could survive for another hour. If it failed completely, the fortress would be swallowed from within, street by street. The first Macedonians through the gap fought for space among shattered stones with no room left for clean formations or sweeping tactical movement. Shields pressed close together as men struggled over rubble and fallen bodies, spears striking through thick dust where almost nothing could be seen clearly. Every single step beyond that wall had to be forced through weight and discipline rather than any clever maneuver. Then more Macedonians reached the breach from behind the first wave, and the pressure increased faster than the defenders could possibly contain it. Batis's soldiers tried desperately to push the attackers back into the broken wall, but the opening no longer belonged to Gaza alone. Alexander's men began pouring through in greater and greater numbers, and the battle spilled beyond the breach into the streets themselves. Gaza lost the advantage that had protected it for weeks the moment the enemy stood inside its walls. Alleys, doorways, rooftops, and courtyards all became scattered places of desperate fighting. Defenders struck from whatever corners still offered cover, and Macedonian soldiers answered with steady, grinding pressure through the narrow spaces between buildings. The city resisted, but its defense began losing shape almost immediately. Groups of defenders found themselves separated from one another as the advancing troops cut through the streets. Some fell back toward inner positions that were already dangerously crowded. Others held small passages until they were completely surrounded and overwhelmed. Batis had prepared Gaza for hunger, for siege, for pressure from every direction outside its walls, but no amount of preparation could restore a wall that had already been broken open. The longer the fighting continued, the deeper the Macedonians advanced into the heart of the city. Gaza fell after weeks that had cost Alexander blood, time, and very nearly his life. What followed was brutal, even by the standards of ancient warfare. The city was looted, its male population killed, and its women and children taken away as captives. For Gaza, the decision to resist had ended in devastation. For Alexander, the road south finally stood open, but this was never a clean or glorious victory. Gaza had delayed him, wounded him, and forced him to completely reshape the battlefield in front of an army used to winning through speed alone. And Batis, the commander who had held out longer and cost Alexander more than any other city on it, was finally brought before him in defeat. According to the ancient historian Curtius Rufus, Batis refused to kneel, meeting his conqueror with silence rather than submission, even with nothing left to bargain with. That silence, by some accounts, enraged Alexander enough that he ordered Batis tied to a chariot and dragged around the very walls he had once defended with everything he had. With Gaza finally broken, the road into Egypt opened at last, and there Alexander found a welcome unlike anything this fortress had ever offered him. Many Egyptians, weary after generations of Persian rule, greeted him not as a conquering invader, but as something closer to a liberator. One city had bled wall by wall to keep him out. Another opened its doors freely and helped shape him into a king rather than just a general. Gaza was never Alexander's greatest battle, and it was never his most celebrated victory in the way Gaugamela or Tyre would come to be remembered. But it marked a narrow, brutally costly hinge between conquest and kingship, the last serious resistance standing between him and the Nile. It revealed both sides of the man who would go on to build one of history's largest empires almost from nothing. The strategist patient enough to outbuild an entire hill, rather than throw men against it recklessly, and the conqueror ruthless enough to punish defiance without mercy once the fighting had finally ended. Do you think Batis's refusal to kneel was courage, stubbornness, or something harder to name that sits somewhere between the two? Let me know what you think in the comments below, and if stories like this one pull you into history the same way they keep pulling me in, subscribe and stay for the next one.